Late afternoon, 30th April 1945, inside the Führer bunker beneath central Berlin, Adolf Hitler cannot escape because the Reich's last weeks collapse into a sealed system of fuel shortage, encircled geography, and chain of command decay that makes flight mechanically impossible, not just dangerous. Adolf Hitler is the dictator of Germany whose power depends on communications, loyal security units, and a functioning state to move him. And the Reich is the wartime German system that turns industry, rail, and authority into military movement and collapses when those networks break. The final days are the moment when every exit becomes a choke point, and every choke point becomes an Allied gun line. It looks like a man choosing to die. But it guarantees something simpler. Even if he wanted to run, the map and the fuel say no. Berlin is under bombardment, the streets are broken, and the last functional decisions are happening underground, while above ground, a million-level battle is closing like a vice. The distance to any safe exit is not measured in miles. It is measured in controlled intersections, bridges, checkpoints, and hours you no longer own. Here's what most people believe. Hitler stayed because he was fanatical, cowardly, or theatrical, and that any determined dictator could slip away. Now let's test that with the constraints and the numbers. The popular story is familiar. The bunker becomes a tomb. Hitler refuses to face capture. He takes the easy way out. It becomes a morality tale about personal will, but the simple story collapses when you follow the constraints. Before we continue, Oresti, make a prediction. Did Hitler fail to escape because he lacked courage or because the Reich's logistics and geography removed the option? Start with the first constraint, fuel. Because Germany's fuel system is destroyed by 1945, they are forced to ration movement like blood, not like gasoline. They didn't have the option to run convoys, relocate headquarters, and fly leaders on demand the way they did earlier in the war. This looks like a choice, but it's a constraint. No fuel means no mobility, and no mobility means no escape plan, survives contact with the calendar. By the end, Hitler's escape would require vehicles, pilots, aviation gasoline, a secure airstrip, and a corridor of airspace that is not a shooting gallery. He has none of those in reliable quantities. And that's the part people miss. An escape is not a single vehicle. It is an entire supply chain that must function for one person. Second constraint, the geography of encirclement. Because Berlin is surrounded, any move outward is forced through a tightening ring of Soviet units. They didn't have the option to pick a quiet road and slip through the countryside. The city is not a maze with hidden exits. It is a pocket. Pockets don't have exits. They have breaches. To understand this, you have to look at what Berlin becomes in late April, not a capital, but an island of rubble inside enemy territory. Third constraint, communications collapse. Because the Reich's command network is breaking, they are forced to act on delayed information, broken radio links, and fantasy reports. They didn't have the option to coordinate a complex extraction that depends on timing. A successful escape is a choreography. A collapsing regime can barely do improvisation. Hitler is not escaping alone. He is dragging the entire security apparatus of his own paranoia with him. Guards, drivers, couriers, aides, codes, and secrecy procedures. Those systems are heavy. Heavy systems drown when the state's machinery fails. Fourth constraint, internal incentives. Because Hitler's inner circle is built on fear and loyalty displays, they are forced to tell him what he wants to hear and to compete for proximity instead of building hard plans. They didn't have the option to speak plainly and say, "There is no road, there is no airfield, there is no fuel, and your presence blocks rational decisions." In a dictatorship, honesty is treason. So the bunker becomes a feedback loop. The worse reality gets, the more the system demands belief. And belief produces bad decisions. Now, put numbers on it, because without numbers, the encirclement becomes abstract. Anchor. By late April, the Battle of Berlin involves roughly 2.5 million Soviet troops and hundreds of thousands of German defenders across the wider operation, with Berlin itself contested block by block. Compare, that is not a raid you can dodge or a front you can sneak past. It is an entire military region converting roads into firing lanes. Convert, For an escape party, every mile outward is not distance. It is a sequence of enemy-controlled zones you must pass without being noticed, challenged, or shot. Punch. When the enemy brings millions, the landscape stops being geography and becomes a sensor. Now ask the question people never ask. What would an escape physically require in those last days? It would require one of three options. Option 1, air extraction. Option 2, armored breakout. Option 3, disguised civilian flight. Each one is crushed by a different constraint. Air extraction fails because air requires infrastructure. Infrastructure is the first thing that dies. An aircraft needs a usable runway, or at least a controlled landing ground, a pilot, fuel, and protection. But by late April, Berlin is being shelled, the airspace is contested, and the Germans are not operating like a normal air force. Even if a single plane could land, it would need a clear window and a reason the Soviets and their anti-aircraft units would miss it. Here's the paradox. The more important the passenger, and the larger the signature of the operation. Secrecy demands small, safety demands large. You cannot have both. Now the second number weapon, anchor. By 1945, Allied bombing and fuel shortages have strangled German aviation, and operational flights become rationed events rather than routine. Compare. In 1941, leaders could move with planned air corridors. By 1945, even moving supplies by air is a gamble. Convert. If your regime cannot reliably fly ammunition to frontline units, it cannot reliably fly a dictator out of a surrounded city. Punch. Fuel collapse turns a plane into a wish. Armored breakout fails because armor requires mass and momentum. If you want to punch through an encirclement, you need a concentrated force, fuel, ammunition, and a clear objective beyond the ring. Berlin's defenders do not have that. They have fragments, Volkssturm units, exhausted soldiers, and pockets of armor without a coherent supply chain. And there is a deeper problem. A breakout must be timed with external relief, or it becomes a suicide drive into deeper enemy territory. Relief does not exist. Now the third number weapon, anchor. The Soviets close on Berlin with multiple fronts, and the outer ring tightens in the days before the final assault, shrinking maneuver space hour by hour. Compare. A breakout works when the ring is thin and uncertain. Here, the ring is layered and deliberate. Convert. Even if you pierce one line, you run into the next, and each mile you travel burns fuel you cannot replace. Punch. A breakout without a supply line is not escape. It is a slower way to be captured. Disguised civilian flight fails for a simpler reason. Berlin is not a city you can walk out of like a commuter. The roads are clogged, bridges are contested, and Soviet units are searching for officers, weapons, and suspicious movement. A disguised man still needs to cross a front line. Front lines are not lines. They are zones, and a dictator's face is not easily erased. You can shave a mustache. You cannot shave recognition. Now myth bust, the most seductive idea. Myth. Hitler could have escaped to a redoubt in the Alps or disappeared into South America if he had wanted. Why it spread? Because it keeps the story alive. It creates mystery. It also flatters the idea that evil is always clever and always slippery, which makes the world feel like a thriller. Replace it with the stronger model. The stronger model is that by late April and early May, the Reich cannot move high-value people safely because the state has lost the three things movement depends on: fuel, secure routes, and credible identity control. This is not about will. It is about transport capacity and enemy dominance. Look at what evidence would actually matter: fuel allocation records, traffic control orders, airfield status reports, unit diaries describing roadblocks, and the physical map of who holds which bridges and rail nodes. Those documents are boring. That is why the myth wins. Now move into the domino effect, because once the constraints stack, the timeline collapses. Once the Soviets cross the Oder and approach Berlin, the next problem is that the outer defensive lines fail faster than the regime's planning rhythm. That forces Hitler to concentrate command in Berlin because he believes control is centralization. That triggers physical entrapment because centralization in a surrounded city is the opposite of an escape posture. At that point, the timeline collapses and the bunker becomes both headquarters and cage. And inside the cage, the incentives get worse. The moment escape becomes difficult, proposing it becomes politically risky. Advisors don't want to be the one suggesting flight, because flight can be framed as betrayal. So each day the option becomes harder, and each day fewer people push it. This is how dictators die. Not always by one dramatic choice, but by a system that punishes the people who would propose the last rational move. Now the fourth number weapon, and use it to show the scale of administrative breakdown. Anchor. By the final week of April, German units in and around Berlin include a patchwork of regular army remnants, SS formations, police units, and hastily mobilized civilians. Compare. An orderly evacuation needs unified command and clear rules. A patchwork force produces conflicting checkpoints, conflicting orders, and panic. Convert. The more fragmented your defenders, the more likely your own lines block you, misdirect you, or collapse under you. Punch. Fragmentation turns escape route into crowd. Hitler couldn't escape, not because no physical path existed in theory, but because no reliable path existed that could be executed under fire, with fuel scarcity, and with collapsing command. A dictator is not a lone runner. A dictator is a moving headquarters. A moving headquarters requires radios, encryption, staff, security, transport, and supplies. When those are gone, you are not a dictator anymore. You are a man underground. Now zoom in on the bunker itself because it becomes the final expression of the system. The Führer bunker is not just a shelter, it is a command node designed to keep authority functioning under bombardment. It depends on couriers, generators, ventilation, and a constant flow of information. In other words, it is a machine that exists to deny reality. That machine is perfect for staying. It is terrible for leaving. Leaving would mean stepping out of the one environment where Hitler's authority still feels real. Above ground, authority is measured in bullets and road control. Underground, authority is measured in who is allowed to speak, who is allowed to enter, and who is allowed to give orders. A dictator will always prefer the environment where his power still works. And that preference becomes another constraint. Because Hitler's command style depends on personal control and symbolic presence, he is forced to remain near the center of his own myth. They didn't have the option to relocate him quietly without shattering the regime's remaining cohesion. This looks like ego, but it is also a structural constraint. If the leader leaves, the fiction of unity collapses, and unity is the last remaining weapon. Now, the fifth number weapon, using a human conversion. Anchor. In the final days, Berlin's civilian population is still counted in the hundreds of thousands, trapped amid fighting and shortages. Compare. An evacuation of a leader in peacetime is a private operation. In Berlin, it would be a needle pushed through a mass of terrified bodies and armed men. Convert. Every additional person on the roads increases chaos and increases the chance of exposure. Punch. Crowds do not hide you when everyone is desperate. Crowds reveal you. So even the idea of blending in is worse than people imagine. Now, bring in the viewer commitment again by testing the instinct. If you believe escape is just willpower, then you should expect a simple plan: a car at night, a disguise, a road. But the constraints say the opposite. Every plan needs a chain of dependencies, and the dependencies are broken. Now show the cascade of consequences inside the bunker. Once the external situation worsens, the bunker's information becomes less reliable. That forces leadership to rely on hope, rumors, and hand-picked reports. That triggers fantasy orders. Units that do not exist are ordered to counterattack. Corridors that do not exist are assumed open. At that point, escape planning becomes not just difficult, but delusional, because delusion is now the regime's operating system, and that's the part people miss. You cannot plan an escape in a world where you cannot even plan a resupply. Now, myth bust another oversimplification. Myth. If Hitler had left earlier, he could have reconstituted command from another location and continued the war. Why it spread? Because it keeps the idea of the war could have lasted longer in a neat narrative. Replace it with constraints. Because German industry is being overrun, fuel is gone, and Allied armies are deep inside Germany. Relocating the leader does not create new divisions, new ammunition, or new food. It only relocates the collapse. After-action reports, unit diaries, and production ledgers all point to the same reality. The war's ending because the system is out of resources and out of time. A leader cannot command fuel into existence, now the sixth number weapon, and make it an opportunity cost. Anchor. By 1945, Germany has lost vast portions of its territory, oil sources, and transport capacity, and the Allies are advancing from west and east simultaneously. Compare. A single-front collapse can sometimes be stabilized by shifting reserves. A two-front squeeze consumes reserves faster than you can move them. Convert. Every division moved to one side weakens the other, and every mile traveled burns fuel that cannot be replaced. Punch. Two fronts turn strategy into arithmetic you cannot cheat. So, escape to keep fighting is not just unrealistic, it is mathematically empty. Now we can speak plainly about the human decision without turning it into melodrama. By late April, Hitler likely understands that capture is probable and that his personal fate will be used as a symbol. He also understands that his remaining control exists only inside the bunker system. So he chooses the only domain where he can still decide outcomes, the private decision to die. But even if you strip away psychology, the constraints still stand. The Reich has become a broken transport network under enemy dominance. That is why he couldn't escape. Now, land the conclusion with inevitability and cost. Was it stupid? Maybe. Could it have been avoided? Here's the hard part. If Hitler had left earlier, he might have lived a few more weeks or months, but he would not have restored the Reich's fuel, production, or fronts. By the time Berlin is encircled, the escape problem is no longer personal courage. It is the collapse of the machine that once moved him. In the end, fuel collapse and encirclement beat personal will. So here's the question tied to the opening. If a regime is built on control, what happens to its leader when the control infrastructure dies? Does he still have choices, or is he just the last passenger on a system that can no longer move? If you want real history, not myths, subscribe.